This period of time we refer to as ordinary time, not because it's bland or routine, though it may sometimes feel that way to some of you. But it's ordinary in the sense of the ordinal numbers. It's sequential, one after the other. So today is the 17th Sunday, and last week was the 16th Sunday. And amazingly, next week will be the 18th Sunday. It's great how that works. And the focus of these weeks in ordinary time is really basic Christianity, Jesus 101. And you hear all the time, follow Jesus, and you say, okay, Father, well, show us how to follow Jesus. And I answer that the good news is first that you don't follow me, because we have great examples in the Scriptures. We don't have to look far to figure out how to model our behavior on those people. The example we had this week and last week is Abraham. We often call Abraham our father in faith because he was the first to follow God as we understand God, monotheistic God, not the pagan gods that everyone else followed in Abraham's day. And so we hear these stories from the book of Genesis. We're seeing actually how God is teaching Abraham to follow him and to know him. When I lived next door to Arizona State University, it was originally called the Arizona Normal School. It was a teacher's college. So teachers taught other teachers so that they could teach the rest of us. And God is doing something similar. He's teaching Abraham so that he can teach others, and then we all can learn from him. Now today it helps to recap the story to get the right context. God has spoken to Abraham, but it was just a voice that he heard. And it must have been a very convincing voice because Abraham listened to the voice and followed its direction. And in last week's passage, the voice appears to Abraham in the flesh in the form of three visitors. And Abraham recognized that this voice was now appearing to him, and it had entered his world. It had broke into his consciousness. So he reacts as he should have reacted. He focuses all his attention on these mysterious visitors. And as we saw by way of contrast in the gospel with Mary and Martha, Mary has the right reaction when Jesus enters her home. She focuses all her attention on him. Martha, on the other hand, is way too distracted and too anxious, and she misses the great gift that has come into her home. So after Abraham showed lavish hospitality to the heavenly visitors, they tell him, I will come this time next year and Sarah will have a son. And now Sarah is listening behind the curtain, and she hears the promise and she laughs it off. And then later she denies that she had laughed, but eventually she has the son. She names him Isaac, which means son of laughter. And he grew up to be the world's first stand-up comic. No, he didn't. Then as the visitor is walking away, Abraham follows behind him. And that's where we come to today's reading. They were walking towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says out loud, shall I tell Abraham what I am about to do? And then he says to himself, yes, because I want Abraham to inherit the promises I made to him and that he might be a righteous man. So God tells Abraham he's going to Sodom and Gomorrah to see what was going on there, and he would probably destroy the place. Now, to be righteous means to be in a right relationship with God. And this is what Abraham is learning and what we all need to learn as well. The relationship between God and Abraham is more of a peer-to-peer relationship, a friend to friend, or even a parent to a child. And so Abraham prays. And in this context, prayer is simply defined as a conversation with God. And isn't that what we're actually doing here this morning? We come to Mass, we focus our attention on God, we remind God that he is just and merciful, and then we hand him our list of things we want. And we say thank you. This is exactly what Jesus is talking about in today's gospel. He gives us the familiar picture of God as Father. And this isn't just an illustration drawn from family life, though of course it's that at its heart. And Jesus' illustrations about giving a child real food rather than poisonous snakes makes the point. If we are ever tempted to imagine God as a tyrant, who would take delight in giving us things that weren't good for us, we should remember these pictures that Jesus is giving us in this gospel passage and think again. But the illustration is much bigger than that. The idea of God as Father goes right back to Abraham and Israel in slavery, needing rescue. Israel is my firstborn son, declared God to Pharaoh through Moses and Aaron, so let my people go. From then on, to call on God as Father was to invoke the God of the Exodus, the liberating God, the God whose kingdom was coming, bringing bread for the hungry, forgiveness for the sinner, and deliverance from the powers of darkness. And so Jesus says, if you who are wicked know how to give good gifts to your children, that's so true. I watched my sisters raise their children, and a few of them were real challenges. They got into serious trouble, disappointing their parents. And yet they still love their children, they still continue to feed and shelter them, and all the while helping them to sort out their problems. And the kids obviously didn't appreciate it, at least not at first, but as they grew, they realized the shape of love wasn't always what they imagined it to be. And so the prayer Jesus gives his followers is a prayer for people who are following Jesus on the kingdom journey. Jesus in Luke's gospel is on the way to Jerusalem to act on behalf of God's name, which had been dragged through the mud, and as his people forgot the lessons of Abraham. He had provided bread for the journey, and now the breaking of the bread was to become the sign of his presence in the church and the bond between his followers. He was already offering forgiveness and would accomplish it completely in his death. And he was already demanding from his followers that they imitate the graciousness of his Father in forgiving their enemies, let alone each other. And as we've already seen and will see more in detail, he was waging war against the powers of evil so that he could ultimately deliver us from it. And so pray, have that conversation with God on a regular basis. Pray even when with that dogged and funny determination that you do with a sleepy friend who you hoped would help you out in a tight spot.